Good evening and welcome. The clock is ticking towards war. American-led troops mass on the Kuwait-Iraq border with just 4 hours to the deadline. Baghdad is a virtual ghost town. The remaining residents brace themselves for the imminent war. The cabinet decides that American military planes should maintain their access to Shannon Airport. And changing times at Croke Park, the redevelopment plans for Hill 16 get the go-ahead. American-led troops are tonight on the Kuwait-Iraq border, preparing for an invasion that now looks imminent. Troops have entered the demilitarized zone between the two countries, and US and British warplanes have attacked artillery positions in southern Iraq. And there are reports tonight that bombs and cruise missiles are being loaded onto B-52 bombers at the RAF base in Fairford. In Kuwait, almost 200,000 American and British troops have taken up battle positions on the Iraqi border. With less than 4 hours to go before the US ultimatum expires, Saddam Hussein shows no signs of going into exile with his sons, despite an offer of asylum from Bahrain. And Iraq's Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz held a news conference in Baghdad to refute rumors that he had defected.
For these troops, the waiting is over. Thousands of British and US soldiers are making their way in convoy across the Kuwaiti desert, although a severe sandstorm in the region is slowing them down.
We got to follow the vehicles in front of us, on most convoys, and as the dust storms kick up, if they get more than 20 meters away from me, it's hard to see them.
And President Saddam Hussein will be in Baghdad when they arrive. He has refused to leave before 1 o'clock tomorrow morning, as the US is demanding. And the Iraqi parliament, meeting in emergency session, has backed his stance. His ministers offered him unconditional support and said they were willing to give up their lives for him. Also meeting today was the UN Security Council, but neither the US Secretary of State nor the British Foreign Secretary was present to hear Chief UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix present his latest report. His inspectors have now left Baghdad, and although Russia and France have again expressed their opposition to the military campaign, the Security Council will now turn its attention to the looming humanitarian crisis. The Chief Weapons Inspector himself expressed disappointment that his inspections had been curtailed. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft have made their biggest leaflet drop yet into Iraq, telling civilians that they do not want to harm them and trying to persuade the military to stand aside when the coalition forces arrive. A small number of soldiers are reported to have already surrendered to US troops in Kuwait. Sinead Crowley, RTE News.
The citizens of Baghdad are preparing for invasion. Those who have been able to find refuge in neighbouring countries have already left. Those who have stayed behind are trying to find enough food, medicine and water to ensure their survival.
This afternoon, the Iraqi capital resembled a ghost town. In the commercial heart of Baghdad, the shop shelves were empty, owners having moved their goods to warehouses, fearing bombing or looting. Prices have doubled and even trebled in the last few days. Many are selling their valuables to buy in as many supplies as possible. And staff at the city's medical centre fear they won't have enough stock to deal with the casualties. Those who can are fleeing, forming queues along the roads. Aid workers say they expect up to 3.5 million people to flee, within the region of 600,000 seeking refuge in neighbouring countries. At a surprise press conference this afternoon, Iraq's Prime Minister came out to deny rumours that he'd either defected or fled.
Well, the rumour about me now is clear. You are seeing me with you here in the glorious city of Baghdad. So it is one of the easiest rumors to challenge.
Baghdad is expected to be the focus of much of the fighting. Before ground troops have reached their target, government and military headquarters will be targeted by air. Resistance is expected to be fiercest here, and at road crossings and in front of official buildings, Iraqi guards have taken up their positions. Some armed soldiers, others in civilian clothing, poised behind their sandbagged defences. Baghdad tonight is a city in waiting. Dimna Maroney, RTE News.
Our correspondent Mark Little joins us now by video phone from northern Iraq. Mark, you're in the Kurdish-controlled area. Tensions must be running very high there tonight.
They are, but I have to tell you, I'm in a deserted little village just outside the city of Chamchamal, which is on the front line between Kurdish forces and Iraqi forces, who are about a mile away from where we're standing at the moment. It's eerily quiet here tonight. The only sound you hear really is the sound of barking dogs in this town, which has been emptied of its residents over the past couple of days in anticipation of war. However, we have been hearing and seeing signs of nervousness on both sides. We've been hearing occasional gunfire and heavier caliber weapons fired close to the front line. We're not quite sure if they're coming from Iraqi troops firing into this area or if it's the other way around. But we have been seeing also nervousness on the part of the Kurdish militia force, the Peshmerga. The only things you see are occasional patrols of the Peshmerga, but they moved us out of Chamchamal tonight, saying it was for our own safety because we were getting too close to the front line. So nervousness on both sides evident here tonight, but at the same time this eerie quiet descending on this part of the world.
And during the day, Mark, have there been any signs of refugees on the move?
Yes, very definitely. On the road down tonight, we were passing by tractor trailers loaded down with men, women and children and their possessions. We've also noticed that the bigger cities in the Kurdish enclave, Soleimani and Erbil, have been emptying all day of their residents, people fleeing to the countryside. Their fear is not necessarily American attack, but the fear of retaliation from Saddam Hussein. But of course, the big fear in terms of refugee movement is inside Iraq itself. The big fear for humanitarian organizations is that right now we're not being able to see the full scale of the fleeing from the cities, of the exodus from the big Iraqi cities in anticipation of American action. And I think the full scale of any refugee crisis, although we're starting to see, I think, the tip of the iceberg, won't become apparent until after the Americans move in and complete the first stage of their military action.
Mark, thanks for joining us. And our Washington correspondent Carol Coleman joins us now. Carol, what's the mood in the capital as the deadline looms?
Well, in official Washington, if you want to put it that way, it's one of the quietest days we have seen here in weeks. There's been no sign of President Bush or any of his war cabinet. There hasn't been a peep out of anyone on Capitol Hill. We understand that the President wrote a letter to Congress today saying that diplomacy has failed, that it's now time for war. It's the only option left. We understand that the President has also had a 20-minute conversation by telephone with Tony Blair, obviously wrapping up loose ends, and also he's been talking to the commanders on the ground, trying to decide exactly when to launch this war. But we believe we won't see the President again until he appears on television here to tell the nation and the world that he has ordered the troops into battle.
Is the Pentagon saying anything about these reported airstrikes on anti-aircraft artillery and missile systems in southern Iraq?
Yes, they are. They're saying that they did drop bombs on about 10 targets. They say there were artillery pieces which they believe were capable of carrying chemical weapons because, as you know, they fear that Saddam Hussein, in one last desperate act, might try to launch the chemical weapons that he is alleged to have against the troops going into Kuwait. They're also confirming that 17 Iraqi soldiers in northern Kuwait have surrendered, and of course they're hoping that that will be the start of a pattern.
Any signs of increased security in the capital, Carol?
Yes, there is. Of course, intelligence services are saying that there will be retaliatory attacks, and now nobody needs the FBI or the CIA to tell them that. It's just common sense. But there are no-fly zones in force over Washington, D.C. and over New York. The White House has been sealed off, but it didn't stop 25 protesters getting in front of the White House this afternoon to protest against this war, and they were arrested.
Carol Coleman in Washington, thanks for that. The Taoiseach has denied that a government motion approving the use of Shannon and continued overflights by the US military constitutes support for the war to come. But Labour said the measure represented the scrapping of our traditional neutrality. But Gael said the government had failed to address the damage done to the UN by the decision to go to war. The Dáil will debate the situation in a special session tomorrow.
Brian Cowan running the gauntlet of a small group of protesters as he arrived for the cabinet meeting that would decide on the wording of the motion that effectively spells out government policy on the use of Shannon. To no one's surprise, the facilities will continue to be made available to the US. Speaking to RTE this evening, the Taoiseach insisted that did not make us a party to the conflict to come.
Allowing a civilian airport for peripheral ancillary facilities of landing is not engaged or supporting the war effort. That has been it is not participating in the war. That has been our position. That remains our position. For us to withdraw what is there for over 40 years would be seen as a hostile act.
Denying that he'd been put under pressure by George Bush, the Taoiseach acknowledged that there were uncertainties about the legality of the planned military action.
That precisely is the reason why we're not participating in this war. Our decision today is not to participate. Our decision is as long as there's no second resolution, we are out of this.
But the Taoiseach's arguments cut little ice with the opposition.
We believe that Shannon should not be used, nor should overflight facilities be allowed in the circumstances.
Our stand has always been, as a small, non-aligned, neutral country, to be part of the international order for security and peace, that is the United Nations.
This lengthy government motion is already attracting opposition amendments, and with military action possible overnight, the stage is set for a fiery Dáil debate tomorrow. David Davenport, RTE News, Leinster House.
And there we take a break. Coming next on the 9 o'clock news, more on the Iraqi crisis from our chief news correspondent in Kuwait. And a second patient is being tested for the new pneumonia virus in a Dublin hospital. Preparing for an invasion that looks imminent. Our chief news correspondent Charlie Bird is standing by in Kuwait. Charlie, that deadline now less than 4 hours away. What's happening there right now?
Well, Anne, there's an eerie silence around Kuwait City tonight. It's just after midnight here. In just 4 hours' time, at 4 o'clock in the morning here, the deadline will run out, and after that, any time after that, the military action can take place. As you say, there are at least 150,000 American and British forces massed here, just about 30 kilometres from where I'm standing now. Throughout the day, we've had these amazing sandstorms, but the military planners say, as far as they are concerned, with or without the sandstorm, they can go ahead. Mother Nature may put off the inevitability of war for a few hours, but most people here believe it. If it doesn't come tonight, it will come tomorrow.
And is there any exodus of civilians from the country in general, Charlie?
Well, Kuwait was the centre of the last Gulf War. This is a city just bracing itself. We're not far from northern Iraq here. People are saying that if Saddam Hussein wants to take on the people, he may launch some form of a chemical attack on this part of the world. People here don't have gas masks. The journalists have gas masks. Diplomats, all sorts of people have gas masks. It was not the ordinary people in the street. One final thing I would say to you tonight is the 150,000 troops, when they do cross the border into Iraq, we're told they're all going to have on them their chemical suits and their gas masks. Back to the studio.
Charlie, thanks for that. A second patient is undergoing tests in a Dublin hospital tonight for the pneumonia of around 400 Iraqis living in this country. For them, the next few weeks will be difficult and worrying as they try to stay in touch with family members at home.
Abu Ayman managed to get through by phone this morning to his family in Iraq. Some of them have fled Baghdad in the last couple of days, looking for safe haven in the surrounding towns and villages.
The rent in these places have gone 3-4 times the normal prices, and people really are destroyed. It isn't the end of it when they've moved out, really. There's a lot of worry about those who you left behind in Baghdad, and obviously whether that decision was the right decision or not.
His family told him today of armed government roadblocks around the capital, preventing young men from leaving.
They kept on repeating messages of that they trust in God, and whatever's going to happen will happen from God. And people they have a more, I suppose, resigned mood, you know. Fear, certainly, but anxious, yes, but more resigned, really. It's not in their hands.
There are around 400 Iraqis living in this country. Abu Ayman wants to see the end of Saddam, but fears the destruction and death he says the US-led attack will bring. Bernard McMullen, RTE News.
A reminder now that we'll have all the latest news on News 2, that's on Network 2, at 10 minutes to 11 tonight. And the main news again. American-led troops are massing on the Kuwait-Iraq border, preparing for an invasion that looks imminent. Troops have entered the demilitarized zone between the two countries, and US and British warplanes have attacked artillery positions in southern Iraq. Take care. Good night.